All right, well, the room is filling up. We will let people continue to come in as we begin. I want to thank you all for being here today. My name is Helen Schroeder. I'm sure you've seen my email pop up in your inbox over the last couple of weeks as reminders have been coming out. I'm the marketing coordinator at Sigma Assessment Systems, and I will be co-facilitating your webinar today with my colleague, Dr. Ruby Nadler. So for those of you who are new to Sigma, we are a professional services firm that offers talent development, succession planning, and psychological assessments for organizations who are looking to build their internal talent pools. We've been in business for over 50 years, so as a company, we have a lot of experience, and today we'd like to share some of that on the succession planning front. We'll be talking particularly about how to plan for succession in small and medium-sized enterprises, or as you'll hear us referring to it throughout the webinar as SMEs. We've got about 60 minutes together. So for the first 45 minutes or so, Ruby will be taking you through the webinar content. And in the last 10-15 minutes, we'll leave some time for open Q&A. As we're going, feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box at the bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will save some time at the end to go through those. And if we don't get to any of your questions, we will follow up via email. We also will be recording this webinar and sharing the recording with you in a follow-up email. So you don't need to take frantic notes. However, we won't be sharing the slides. So just in case there are any questions about that, we wanted to let you know up front. But you are welcome to take notes, take screenshots of those slides. We just won't be giving you that PowerPoint. All right. And now let me introduce you to my colleague, Ruby. Some of you might remember her from our March webinar. She led the session on how to build leader character. Dr. Ruby Nadler is a leadership consultant at Sigma Assessment Systems, and she specializes in cognition and perception. She has a passion for fusing scientific research with practical application, and she excels in helping clients improve their leadership performance and emotional intelligence through things like individual coaching sessions and workshops. Ruby was the recipient of the Ontario Centres of Excellence Talent Edge Fellowship in 2015, and her research has been featured on platforms including CBC, BBC Radio, Happify, and NPR. At Sigma, Ruby has also had experience delivering our succession planning services, which include coaching, consulting, and educational offerings like our webinar today. And with that, I'll pass it off to Ruby now to start walking you through our webinar content.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks everyone who's joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about succession planning from the perspective of small to medium-sized enterprises. So in the next hour, I'm going to be talking about what succession planning is and what it isn't, the value of succession planning from different perspectives, and some obstacles that you're going to encounter or likely to encounter if you are in a small or medium-sized enterprise. Then I'll be walking us through our 6-step succession planning process and addressing those challenges that you're likely to face. And then, as Helen mentioned, we'll be finishing up with some resources and some time for questions. So first of all, what is succession planning? Succession planning is the process of identifying and developing internal talent to fill critical roles when vacancies occur. And the planning part of succession planning is really fundamental to what we're trying to do here. So we're trying to build up internal talent in advance of vacancies arising. And so true succession planning is an ongoing process of talent development, where we're thinking about what comes next and building our succession bench so that you're prepared for that when it happens. And a lot of organizations think that they are engaging in succession planning when they're actually engaging in something that's called replacement hiring. So this is an important distinction to understand. Replacement hiring is reactive and succession planning is proactive. So succession planning is a long-term process that never really ends, whereas replacement hiring is something that you do when you have an unexpected vacancy or when a vacancy occurs if you haven't prepared for it. And you're just focused on trying to put someone into that position as soon as possible. So it's more of a reactive quick fix than succession planning, where you would be preparing multiple candidates for that role and have an idea of who would be ready to step into that role in advance of it becoming vacant. So this is an important distinction to understand to get a feel for what we're talking about when we're talking about succession planning versus what usually happens when a vacancy occurs. And of course, there is a place for replacement hiring. So it's a valid strategy that you have to engage in sometimes. So you're never going to avoid it entirely, but you want to be moving towards more of a proactive approach to filling your roles over time. And succession planning is really one of the most important things you can do for your organization. And that's because it provides a roadmap for continuity when changes occur. So, and there are really a lot of benefits that are listed here. So it helps you to build a pool of qualified candidates for each critical role. It provides employees with opportunities for growth and development. So what's really nice about succession planning is that not only is it helping to ensure the success and continuity of your organization, which obviously you want to do, but it can also provide a real motivational aspect for employees who are interested in growing and developing their skills and moving into higher level roles. And even for employees that don't want to move into a higher level role, they can also have a valuable role to play as mentors, and it can also be just motivating and really inspire some sense of security for them to know that you are an organization that is preparing for the future. So that can help to keep people from leaving for other organizations. And then, as I'm going to describe, succession planning can also reduce knowledge gaps when vacancies occur. So there are a lot of benefits for succession planning. And if you're in a small to medium-sized enterprise, you're really going to feel the benefits of engaging in succession planning because you're also more likely to feel those negative impacts of vacancies when they do occur in your organization, just by virtue of being smaller. So we're just going to do a quick poll now. Do you feel your organization engages in succession planning or more so in replacement hiring? So I'll just give you a moment to respond. So the results indicate a lot of you are saying, so 46% of you are saying that you engage primarily in replacement hiring. 42% of you are saying that you engage in a mix of both. And 13% of you are saying that you engage in succession planning, which is great. So we've got a real mix there. And that really mirrors what we know from some other recent research that's been done. So we have almost the same split, but a little more on the mixed side. So studies have found that less than 50% of organizations that are small to medium sized have a succession plan. So only 10% of all companies have a formal documented plan in place. So that's interesting that we got almost the same numbers there. And almost 60% in a larger survey of people perhaps less interested in succession planning had no plan in place. And again, succession plans are really especially important for small to medium-sized enterprises where you're really going to feel those vacancies when they occur. And there are some unique considerations for small to medium-sized enterprises. So the overall process of succession planning is going to look similar for most organizations. There are a few challenges that, again, you're going to feel a little more strongly or be more likely to encounter when you're walking through and trying to create a succession plan. So small to medium-sized enterprises are more likely to have greater role complexity by virtue of having a smaller team with people wearing many different hats often. And so you end up with people with a lot of really unique knowledge, which is great, right? So they're really good at their role and they're probably have added to it over time and developed it. But it can pose some challenges when you're trying to figure out how do I prepare to replace this person and what are they like, what is their role and what are they doing? And then by virtue of being smaller, you've got a smaller internal talent pool to work with. So succession planning is about trying to build up that internal pool of talent so that you can promote and promote from within. But that can be harder to do in a smaller sized organization. And then of course, you may be more likely to be dealing with budget or other resource related limitations. So these are all things that we're going to address, some solutions for and some ideas for how you can approach them. But what I'd like to do first is walk you through our 6-step succession planning process, because once we have that shared understanding, it'll make it easier to talk about how to address these challenges. So this is an overview of Sigma's 6-step succession planning process. And this process has been adopted by organizations throughout North America in a variety of industries. So everything from agriculture to government to not-for-profits, a real range are using the succession planning process. So it's likely, regardless of your industry and the size of your company, it's likely that you could apply this process to it and use it to create a succession plan for your organization. And you'll see on the right-hand column in green that each stage is associated with 1 or 2 key tools that can help to simplify the succession planning process and really support you through it, because there are a lot of steps and it can be overwhelming at first when you're just getting used to what is it going to look like if you're starting from scratch to create a full succession plan. And again, this process is helpful to follow if you've only got a handful of employees or thousands of employees. But in particular, today we're going to be talking about what this looks like for small to medium-sized enterprises. But the key idea is that this 6-step process is a structured process that can support you every step of the way with creating a succession plan. And Helen will share a link to the resources that are on that right-hand column. So she's going to share, I believe, a link to what we've got on our website, and all of those worksheets are actually available for free on our website, so you can access them as needed throughout the session or after the session with those links. So the first step of the 6-step succession planning process is to identify your critical roles. So the goal of this process, or of this stage, is to identify the roles your organization should be targeting as part of the succession program. And it's really quite common for your mind to go to those senior level, those high leadership roles when you're thinking about what are the key roles we want to make sure we have covered. So it's really common to think of upper management and leadership positions, but you want to be careful to be comprehensive and really think broadly at this point. So when you're just getting, particularly if you're just getting started with this process, you don't want to inadvertently overlook a key role, work through the process and realize that you really have failed to prepare for filling a key role at a different level. So you want to also look at your administrative staff, IT, anyone who is closely involved with key parts of your organization that can be hard to fill or highly skilled. So you want to think about areas with high dependencies where a lot of people are relying on them. And you want to think about people that are just really the owner of a certain area. So something, it can be frequently something like IT where they're highly specialized. They know how your systems work. And if they were gone, you don't really have anyone else in the organization that you can tap with those skills. So you want to consider both essential people and essential positions when you're thinking about this. And again, this is particularly relevant in small to medium-sized enterprises where you have people wearing a lot of different hats and you have a lot of role complexity. The next stage is to build success profiles for each of those critical roles that you've identified. So once you have your list of those critical roles, you want to think about what are the skill sets, what are the competencies that contribute to success in those roles. And you want to create one success profile for each critical role. And so this can be, again, quite time consuming at the beginning, but it's really a worthwhile step to take because you can't prepare people, you can't build that internal bench if you don't know what contributes to success in that role. So you want to think about those competencies that are important for success in the role. And you also want to think about success in the organization more broadly. So again, what we're trying to do here is to just really get those, really think comprehensively and be creative in terms of thinking about, what do we need from this role right now? Like the person who's in this role, what helps to make them successful? But then to also think more broadly, to think about success currently and what success might look like in the future. So you want to really take a comprehensive look and think about it from a few different angles. And the worksheet that we have on our website, the Build Success Profile worksheet, helps you to think about each of those perspectives in turn. The next stage is to nominate successors. So once you have a success profile for each of your critical roles, excuse me, and you know what success is going to look like, you want to think about who would be a good successor for that role. And again, you want to think really wide and broadly about it. So you want to think of the entire leadership pipeline that's feeding into that role, because we're not like in replacement hiring, you're not just, we're trying to get away from a replacement hiring. You don't want to be counting on just one key person to fill that role. You want to think about the whole pipeline that leads into that role so that you can identify an entire bench. And you're not just looking for one person. So we're looking for several people that can fill that role, the whole pipeline going into it. So you might want to think about if you've got the director level, you want to work on creating a bench for that director level. And excuse me, I'm just going to cough for a moment. Excuse me. You don't just want to think about the person following immediately to the director level role. You want to think about the managers below them and the people supporting the managers so that you can identify, a comprehensive pipeline and work on developing them all potentially. And so you want to be identifying candidates who might be ready for the role in the short, medium, and the long-term future. So not only who's going to be ready in the next few years, but who's going to be ready in the next 3 to 5 years. Then you want to work on assessing their development needs. So once you've identified people that you might want to include in the succession planning process, you want to see where they're at in terms of their development. So what are their strengths and what are their development opportunities? And then you can compare those strengths and development opportunities to the success profiles that you've created. So, and this serves a number of purposes. So we're strong proponents of assessments. We are obviously an assessment provider, and there are a number of benefits to it. So you want to validate each candidate's position on the succession bench. So again, you can't really place people in a succession bench if you don't have an objective measure of where they're at. So that's one thing that assessments are really useful for. They also provide you with a baseline skill level so that you can see the impact of any development that's occurred. So you don't want to just jump into developing people and then assess, because you won't know if your talent development process has actually made an impact or not. And so again, as an assessment provider, we encourage you to make sure that you pay special attention to the assessment that you use. So you want to make sure you're using a valid and reliable assessment that is actually targeting the skills that are relevant to develop for succession. And then this is the part that gets really exciting for me. So the first 4 stages, it's a lot of work depending on the size of your organization and how many success profiles you have to create and what those pipelines look like. But when we get to developing talent, this is the real payoff that you get, is you start to help succession candidates develop their strengths and overcome any skills or obstacles to development that they might face. So this is where you're really building that talent bench, and this is all of the work that you've done up to now pays off in this development stage. So this is the stage that I'm typically working with, is coaching and developing people. And in our process, we are proponents of using a coach, whether that's internal or external to your organization, to help to develop talent. And then the final stage is to measure progress. And this is, again, one just like assessment that can be tempting to skip over, but you want to make sure that you're using metrics that reflect success in your company. And the goal is to track your progress, to boost engagement, and really quantify what success looks like. So there are different motivations for engaging in succession planning, and you want to make sure you choose metrics that reflect those motivations so that you can track whether the process is actually having the impact that you were hoping it would. So if you are engaging in succession planning in part to reduce turnover, so maybe you lose a lot of high potential people to other organizations, and you start to work on them with their development, and they start to see that there is a process in place and that there are opportunities for them. Within a couple of years, you might start to see less turnover. So you want to make sure that you are doing a baseline measure of those metrics and identifying what those metrics are going to be, and then tracking them on a regular basis. So that's the 6-step succession planning process in a nutshell. And again, it's applicable to any organization, and a lot of different organizations are using it currently. But there are some unique challenges that you're going to face if you are working with various constraints or the unique circumstances of a small to medium-sized enterprise. So I'm going to talk about that next. So again, these are some of the key challenges for small to medium-sized enterprises, and they are that, one, roles tend to be more complex than in larger corporations. So you have people wearing a lot of different hats, and that can make it hard to identify what it is exactly that you would need to replace. Like what would the job description look like, and what would the real knowledge be for that role? So that can be a little more complicated. And linked with that, people working at smaller enterprises are more likely to hold unique expertise. So you want to make sure you have a system in place to address that. And then by virtue of being smaller, you've got a smaller internal talent pool available to you. So it's not always possible to hire internally. And then smaller enterprises might have budget or other resource related limitations. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn and how you can overcome them. So the first challenge is that when you have greater role complexity, it's harder to identify critical roles. So you're going to hit that first stage of the succession planning process where you're thinking about, okay, what are the roles that are really important? And you might face this challenge right there. So even if your organizational structure is relatively flat and the roles aren't clearly defined, you really want to work to identify these critical roles. So our suggestion for overcoming this challenge is to start by mapping out your organizational chart if you don't have one already. If you have one already, you want to review it and try to make sure that you're building in and noting all those little complexities in the different roles. But when you can see the whole pipeline of the company and how the roles relate to one another, that can really help to reduce that sense of complexity and that feeling that maybe this is just going to be really difficult. So whenever anything feels really complex, by getting out a pen and paper and just plotting things out can make it feel a lot more manageable. The second challenge is that you're going to feel any vacancies in your organization more strongly, potentially, when you're in a smaller to medium-sized enterprise. And that's because when someone walks out the door, they leave for whatever reason, they hold a really large share of unique organizational knowledge. So proportionally, they're holding more knowledge than they would in a larger organization, where there are other people that probably have that knowledge as well. So this is not a negative thing. Like, it's not negative that people are unique knowledge holders, but you really want to create a culture of knowledge transfer and some systems to support knowledge transfer if this applies to your organization, because without a formal knowledge sharing process, it's going to be really difficult to put people into those roles and develop them. So establishing a culture of knowledge transfer is really critical. And it's for this reason. So you can think of the knowledge that people hold, so this applies to yourself as well, as an iceberg. So at the top, you have what's called explicit knowledge. And so in a role, these are things like documents, records, anything that can be referred to, anything that's already documented. So things in databases, and really the tasks included in a job description. These things are explicit knowledge, and it really is only the tip of the iceberg. So what's below it is what's called implicit or tacit knowledge. And this is the knowledge that you gain through learned experience. So this is the things you learn through trial and error. It's things like knowing, even if sometimes there can even be a bit of a mismatch between the explicit knowledge and the by the book way things are done, and then like how do things actually work behind the scenes and in reality. So you want to have a process in place to help people who are really experienced and have a lot of that tacit knowledge to document that knowledge and share it with other people so that it isn't lost in the event that they leave their role. So the knowledge transfer is a whole other topic that we could have a webinar on. And we actually have a free guide on knowledge transfer that you can download. So Helen will share the link for that with you if you don't have a strong knowledge transfer process in place. It is a multi-step process, and just like succession planning, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, but there are steps that you can take to get started with it. So these are the stages of creating a knowledge transfer system. So first you have to identify what knowledge needs to be transferred. And you want to think about both explicit and tacit knowledge, because again, someone coming into a role, they're going to have access to that explicit knowledge, but they're not going to have any of that tacit knowledge. And it can be quite sizable and quite valuable for them to have some exposure to that knowledge and to be able to take it in. Once you've identified that knowledge, you want to prioritize it. So you want to think about what knowledge will have the biggest impact if it's lost. And then you want to create a system to capture and transfer that knowledge. So thinking about how to capture it and how to transfer it. So it can be things like encouraging employees to take notes on how projects go. So how did that project go? What did you learn? Why were certain decisions made? Organizations often don't make records of those things, and that's really valuable experience that would save people in the future a lot of time and trouble if they at least had their bearings in terms of how things went, why things are the way they are now, so that they're not just coming in fresh and thinking that they, can go maybe down the same path that's already been tried or isn't a good idea for some reason. So even employees who plan to stay in their role should be encouraged and given time and systems to transfer that knowledge. And it can be things like having people talk to each other regularly, having debriefs, just sharing information in different ways. And then you want to share and store the knowledge that you've recorded. So you want to make sure that people know about that information and how to access it. And you want to, again, continue to encourage knowledge sharing over time. So it can look like having a buddy when someone is a new hire and brought into a role or brought into like promoted internally, having someone to check in with them and just help them troubleshoot the things that they're encountering and make sure that they're aware of who they can talk to and how they can access that information. And again, this is a whole other topic, and we do have a free guide that you can use to help get your bearings around this idea of knowledge transfer if that's something that you're interested in. The third challenge is that smaller internal talent pools can mean that it's more challenging to fill vacancies. So again, by nature of being a smaller enterprise, when someone leaves, it can make it harder to fill those vacancies. If you want to move someone from one role into another, that solves the problem of the role that was left vacant, but then you have another role to fill. So it can be very challenging and disruptive when vacancies occur in a small organization. And that's why succession planning is so integral and important for small to medium-sized enterprises. So ideally, you do want to be building and developing that internal talent, but it might not always be possible to promote someone internally and to fill that role. So you want to think about in advance those roles that require an internal hire and be prepared to use external hiring as needed. So this is a little bit different than replacement hiring, where you're being really reactive because you're knowing in advance that you're going to have to probably look externally. So that gives you some options in terms of preparing the job descriptions and thinking about exactly who it is, what skills you want to fill for that role. So, and again, this is true for all succession plans. You're not going to always be able to hire internally or promote internally. So sometimes people aren't interested in moving into a different role. People may leave for various reasons. So you want to have a feel for when you are going to promote internally and when you're going to hire externally. And again, it's more likely when you're a smaller organization that you're going to maybe be doing a little more external hiring than if you're in a larger organization where you're able to promote people internally. So you want to promote people internally when the position requires some highly specialized knowledge that's specific to the organization. So again, thinking about that knowledge iceberg and the time it would take someone externally who doesn't have a feel for all of those things and doesn't have that experience, you want to try to hire internally to spare that whole learning process. If you have internal employees who are really interested in moving up into a role and they've been focused on their development and working with a mentor and doing all of the things to get prepared for that role, you want to promote internally. You don't want to leave people like that in their role feeling like there aren't options for them because they're likely going to go somewhere else. You also want to promote internally when things are relatively stable and you're looking to maintain a consistent course of action. And that applies more frequently to when you're looking to fill senior management C-suite levels. So people that are already working internally, they're familiar with the customs and the culture. So if everything is good and you're happy with that, then promoting internally makes sense. But if you're looking to shake things up and you want a fresh perspective or fresh skill sets, then you may want to hire externally for those higher level roles. You also want to hire externally when the position requires skills that aren't, so again, thinking of that knowledge iceberg, if you have roles where there's not much of an implicit knowledge iceberg that is really critical to the role, you can hire externally then. So that's often entry-level roles where if someone has, say, certain administrative experience or customer service experience, they can apply it fairly quickly and readily to your organization. Then there are roles where you need to hire externally because you don't have the talent pool or the skill set that you need. So this can be sometimes things depending on the nature of your industry, of course, things like IT where you need a certain skill set and you don't have anyone in the organization already. It can be when you're moving into a new market or just growing and you want to have add certain things that you haven't had before to your organization. So having a clear understanding of when you want to promote internally and when you want to hire externally can help to overcome that challenge of having the smaller internal talent pool. And the fourth challenge is training and development barriers. So again, by nature of being smaller, you may not have as much of a budget for engaging in a really broad talent development process. So there can be budget constraints. There can also be constraints if you have a smaller number of employees and you want to, say, do a mentoring program or something like that. You can only tap the same person so many times before it becomes too much of a distraction from their everyday role that they need to do. So there are different considerations in place, such as time and money. And another thing is that ready-made training programs might not be well suited to what you're looking for. So the way you can overcome these challenges is to use a variety of tools. So sometimes we get stuck thinking about one option and think talent development has to look one way, or you might see what other organizations are doing. And it's, maybe really big and expensive, or it relies on internal mentors who have there's a lot of support for that and a lot of breadth and a lot of people doing that. And that might not be as applicable for you. So you want to think about things like short-term assignments can be a really great way to give people development opportunities that, it does take time. And it does take motivation, but it doesn't cost you anything to maybe move people around a little bit, let them job shadow, and as well as provide opportunities for informal knowledge sharing. So those are just some ideas for how you can provide some development to your employees that doesn't have to cost a lot of time or money. And again, as assessment providers, we think assessments are also a great tool that you can add in here that, again, doesn't have to take a lot of time and doesn't have to be very costly. So I'm going to talk for a moment about our leadership assessment and how that can apply to that talent development stage of the succession planning process. So leadership assessments are a really great tool for independent learning. Because they help to increase people's self-awareness of their strengths and development opportunities. And they can also provide a lot of structure to development plans. So the assessment that we are a provider of, the Leadership Skills Profile Revised, has a lot of benefits for organizations of all sizes, but can be particularly useful for organizations that want to provide some development support, but again, may not have the internal resources, may not have people that can do a lot of coaching or mentoring. So the focus report that you get when you complete the assessment has a lot of helpful guidance. And we also have some helpful resources online. So we really believe in the LSPR. It's based on decades of research that we've conducted into personality and into job performance. And it uses a 50 competency, our leadership model, which has 50 leadership competencies. So it's really applicable to any role that you can think of. You can map some of these competencies on to success in that role. So it provides a model of leadership performance that can be applied to all of those roles that you've identified when you're making your success profile. It is valid and reliable. So it's cleared not only for use as a leadership development, but it's also cleared for employee selection. So that's really important to us, that the assessments that we use in our coaching and consulting are scientifically valid and applicable to the people that are using them. So the LSPR takes about 20 minutes to complete, and once it's completed, test takers receive the focus report, which again has a whole structured guide for how to develop themselves, and it has customized feedback in it that can help to enhance people's self-awareness around what they might like to do differently. In the last few years, we've also created a whole development series that is available for free on our website. So for each of the 50 leadership competencies that are described in the report and that you get feedback on, you can also look up an in-depth development guide for each of those competencies. And that will give you ideas for what your next steps might want to be if you want to work on enhancing any of those competencies. So if you haven't considered assessments as part of your succession planning process, it adds a measure of objectivity to the process, and it also helps to provide people who are in the process, so your nominated successors, it can be helpful for them to just get their hands on something, and it helps to make the succession planning process feel more real to them because they're getting something out of it. So that's the 6-step succession planning process and the challenges that you're likely to face. So we've talked about each of these challenges and potential solutions for them. So I hope that that was helpful for you. And the succession planning process, so again, the majority of organizations don't have a succession planning process in place because it does take time and it does take effort. And so you want to have a team of people helping to develop the succession plan in your organization. And it's not something that you're going to be able to do overnight. But I hope that by now you feel like you do have options and it is possible for you to create a succession plan. And there is one final big hurdle to creating a succession plan. So again, we've talked about each of those steps and how you can encounter challenges at each point. But implementation is really the largest hurdle that you're going to face. And so you may even have a succession plan in place, but not actually be actively, updating it and moving people through the process. And that's because it is time consuming and it can be challenging. So we have one final resource that can be helpful for you, and that is our succession planning launch series. So the launch series is an 8-hour commitment that's spread across 2 days, and it gives you a full succession plan. So this is something that we've developed from years of working with organizations and working on the succession planning issue, which is succession planning is so important. How do we help more organizations create a succession plan when we know how busy and time crunched they are? So with the succession planning launch series, you participate in 2 half-day workshops, so about 8 hours of your time, and you receive a full succession plan that through all of those 6 stages of development. And you also get to work with our consultants and get customized support. So there's accountability built in, but it really streamlines and makes that process a lot less intimidating to have the consultants basically doing the heavy lifting for you. So that is an option that's available to you. And if you're interested in that, obviously feel free to talk to us after the session. So with that, I'd like to, again, I hope that was helpful for you. So yeah, I'd like to hear if anyone has any questions for me. And yeah, thank you for your engagement and participation through the webinar.
About this process. We've seen it help so many people, so it's something we're really excited about. All right, I've got a few questions for you for our remaining 15 minutes or so. The first one is, who should be responsible for succession planning if it shouldn't just be HR?
Yeah, so yeah, what we hear when we work with organizations is that we get the HR people and they're like, yeah, I've been tasked with creating a succession plan, and it really shouldn't fall to just 1 or 2 people. So if you are one of those people who has been tasked with creating a succession plan, the good news is that we do suggest that it's best to obviously spread that work out, spread those accountabilities and responsibilities, and really bring other people on board with you, because again, this is a complex process. It's a long-term process, and you're not going to be successful if you're just relying on 1 or 2 people's ability to consistently set aside time for it, because it can at times, especially at the outset, be very time consuming. So we suggest creating an advisory committee full of various parties who should be have a vested interest in having a successful succession plan in place. So that looks like senior leaders, people in HR, people in talent development, coming together to make sure that the succession plan happens and that it's carried out over a long-term consistent basis.
Thank you. I'm actually going to share another link for you all here, because we have a blog on how to create a succession advisory team, and it has some helpful tips for who to think about adding and how do you approach that formation process. So I'll send that link in the chat there. Okay, next question. How should I convince senior leadership to devote attention to creating a succession plan?
Yeah, so obviously it's hard to get people's attention sometimes, especially senior leaders who have a lot on their mind. the best way to get anyone's attention about anything is to try to understand what motivates them and what their perspective is. So throughout the session, I talked about some of the negative impacts of not having a succession plan, as well as some of the benefits of having a succession plan. So some of the negative impacts can be things like losing talent, so turnover. It can be being forced to engage in external hiring and being quite reactive when there's a sudden vacancy and you're not prepared. So if any of that resonates with your senior leadership and you know that they're interested in, say, reducing the costs associated with hiring externally, you can speak to the benefits of building up talent internally. If they're interested in reducing turnover and you're having to spend a lot of time training people because there's a lot of turnover, you could speak to the motivational benefits of providing development opportunities for people and reducing that turnover. So there's a lot of different angles that you can take. And the nice thing about succession planning is that you can really speak to those specific concerns, because there are a variety of benefits to engaging in succession planning. And we also have a guide that, again, I think Helen can pull up. She has a moment to share how to get buy-in from your senior leadership, because it really is fundamental to have that buy-in. So your succession plan is much less likely to be successful if you don't have that buy-in and engagement from senior leadership. So that's a really great question.
Yes, and here's the guide. Yeah, and if you're finding as you're going through this process that you could use a few tools or even just some research, please don't hesitate to send us an email, send Ruby an email. Sigma has a lot of resources that we'd be happy to share. So if there's something that you need that isn't coming out during the Q&A or this webinar, still reach out to us. Likely that we can help you. Okay. Found my questions again. There they are. How much of a succession plan should be communicated to employees?
Yeah, so I've talked about some of the motivational aspects of having a succession plan in place. So it can be really reassuring to employees, even those who aren't interested in moving into different roles in the organization, just to know that a succession plan is in place. And for people who are really motivated to move around in the organization, again, that's very motivating to them to see what the options are and to know that they are being viewed as potential successors for roles that they might be interested in. So you do want to share with people once you have a succession plan in development and are hitting those stages of nominating successors and developing your talent. You do want to share with people that there is planning happening. And you can even share things like, as part of the process, you might be asked to complete an assessment, or you might be asked to think about what skill sets contribute to success in a given role, because those are things that are often a part of the succession planning process. So you do want to be open that there is a plan. And obviously, when you're involving people in it, you want them to know and understand what's going on. The part where we don't recommend you share information openly is when you are creating those benches. So when you're validating people's position on a bench, so you've assessed their development strengths, and when you've assessed their strengths and development opportunities, you don't want to let people know, right, that you're on the A level, you're on the B level, you're on the C level. That's not very helpful to people, and it can create a competitive environment, and it can just create some issues. So we suggest obviously keeping that information confidential, but it is overall a positive thing to be engaging in succession planning. So you should think about how you can communicate that to people at different levels of the organization.
Thanks, Ruby. Okay. What do I do if a person I've identified as a succession candidate isn't interested in moving up into their new role?
Yeah, so as a coach, this is something that I encounter relatively often, where you have people who are just not extremely interested in being tasked with a different role. So they're in a good place. They really like their job. They like the people that they work with, and it just suits the other demands in their life at that time. So it can be things like they might have a busy young family and they know that they don't want to have less of a work-life balance, trying to get acclimated to a new role. It can be that they're taking care of an aging caregiver, or that they're the caregiver for an aging parent. So you want to be sensitive to the reasons why someone may not be interested in moving into a role. So you should respect that, and you shouldn't put a lot of pressure on them. What's nice when you have people that are really good at their job and just really flourishing is that they can serve as mentors and help other people to develop the skills that would be necessary for those other roles that you're looking at tapping them for. So that can be one way that they can get involved without feeling that pressure that they're being expected to give up a role that they're really happy in. The other thing that you should keep in mind is that life circumstances do change. And so at the first time you talk to someone about moving into a role, they may really not be prepared to think about it, but it could look different, a year or two out. So keep in mind that if they say no once, you should respect that and move on to other candidates and other avenues for developing your talent. But circumstances do change, so you can always revisit the topic with them in the future.
Thank you. Okay, we have a quick question here. Could you flip back to the slide on replacement hiring versus succession planning while I ask you this next question?
Yes, no problem. Bear with me as I get to that slide that was at the sort of the beginning.
I'll
there we go.
Before we got it already. Okay. Next question. How often should a succession plan be updated?
Yeah, so again, it's a lot of work getting a succession plan in place, and so you're not going to like this answer. So all the work that goes into creating it. Once you have a succession plan in place, you should try to update it every 6 months. So twice a year, just take a look at how things have changed and make any updates. As well, you want to put up, and that's the timeline that we suggest for updating those metrics, right? So you want to be tracking those metrics that you identify in the process. You also want to update your succession plans whenever there's any major change. So a major change could be that someone in your leadership pipeline for a given role moves. So obviously you want to note that and see how things change. Also, if there's any big market changes or industry changes, and you know that perhaps your talent and development budget has been affected, or a certain role may not be able to be prioritized as a result of those changes, you want to make sure whenever anything like that comes to your attention that you go into your plan and make that update. But 6 months is a pretty good timeline on a regular basis.
Thank you. Okay. Looking at the clock, I'm going to ask one more question. This is a little bit of a case study for you here, Ruby. So we have a mid-sized company that is looking to do succession planning. There's a lot of people retiring at the mid-level, and there's top-down pressure to minimize the size of the organization, but they want to define their successors. Problem being, they want to define their successors before they've started developing the people and gone through this whole process. So kind of getting to point Z before you go through A to Z. And that's causing some problems and some tensions in relationships between people jockeying for positions. So would you have any advice for how to approach that kind of a situation?
Yeah. So yeah, that sounds like a situation that I think is going to become more applicable across organizations, unfortunately, where people are retiring, and there's it sounded sorry Helen, did you say that there's pressure on to not replace those roles, or to replace them like as soon as possible?
There's pressure to minimize direct reports. And to clarify, I misspoke. It's retirement at a senior level. So C and EVP level, big roles.
Yeah, and so people are jockeying for those roles. So yeah, exactly what we said will happen when you kind of share that succession information. So I think everyone can appreciate, even if it doesn't personally benefit them, everyone can appreciate the value of trying to be objective and fair in terms of who is moved into a position. So it's great that we have the replacement hiring slide up, actually, because that's exactly sort of what is happening almost, although it's a bit of a mix. You have only really feedback from the person that's in that role and maybe their superiors kind of saying like, this is the person that I want. If that person really is the best fit for the role and they have, you know, a lot of that tacit knowledge, then hopefully people could come to understand that. But I think you really want to make sure that you put some sort of formal system in place, like a vetting system, to reduce the that sense of even hostility or resentment that can come out from feeling like you would have been a good candidate, but you weren't even given a chance. So I think you're going to need to have to do some work to make that process be more objective and to communicate to people what that process is so that they can see for themselves that you are actually following a process. So I hope that's helpful, and we'd be happy to follow up with you if you would like to talk about that situation in more detail after the session.
Yeah, I'd encourage any of you, if you want to talk through specific questions for your organizations, please reach out to us. Our consultants are happy to chat. I am going to wrap up our webinar for today. So just before we go, I'd like to ask if anyone is here to get SHRM professional development credits. I'm going to launch a little poll for that. In order to create your certificates, we need to know who you are. So if you don't want this, you don't need to say no. But for the people who do want this, we do need you to answer yes on this poll so that I can have your full name and get you those certificates. While I leave that up, I'll also just say that if you liked what you saw here today, Sigma is running webinars every month this year. They're on a variety of different topics. We do have another introduction to succession planning coming up in October. And then there's other sessions on talent development or assessment or specific leadership competencies. So take a look at that. And if you don't see what you're looking for, then please don't hesitate to shoot us an email. We're starting slowly to prepare for the 2024 season, and we want to make sure that what we're offering is what people are actually wanting to learn about. So here's the link to those. Take a look, and we hope that we will see you soon. Like we said, if there's anything that we missed, feel free to follow up via email. And once you X out of this webinar, you will see a short feedback survey. We would really appreciate it if you take a minute to answer those questions. We do go through each of them after the webinars and tweak things and adjust them to make sure that it's a good experience. So we value your input and would love to hear what you thought of today's session. And with that, I will let everyone go, and thank you again very much for joining us today. And thank you, Ruby.
Yeah, thanks everyone. It was nice to speak with you.